You've been performing politeness your entire life, and you didn't even know it had a name. Someone walks into the room vibrating with excitement, and something in you calculates instantly. The appropriate response, the correct facial expression, the right amount of enthusiasm to mirror back so they don't feel unseen. You do it in under a second. You've been doing it since you were a child. You match their pitch, their pace, their emotional temperature, not because you feel any of those things, but because some deep, trained part of you decided that your actual internal state is not socially acceptable in this moment. And the cost isn't dramatic. It doesn't feel like a breakdown. It feels like a slow, steady leak. You walk away from conversations mildly depleted, not sure why. You spend an hour with someone who is loud, effusive, emotionally insistent, and afterward you need silence the way a person needs water. And you wonder if something is wrong with you, because they left energized and you left hollow. The label people have put on this, on your reluctance to perform emotional responses you don't actually have, is that you are cold, or distant, or difficult to read, maybe rude. Maybe you're told you need to be more present, more open, more enthusiastic. You've heard some version of this enough times that part of you started to believe it. But here is the crack in the door. What if the thing you've been told is a social failure, is actually a form of social integrity that most people have been trained out of Fivert? Don't answer that yet. Just hold it, because before we get to what this actually is, we need to spend real time inside what it has cost you. The reframe only lands when you understand the full weight of what you've been carrying. There was a parent, a teacher, a group of other children, someone whose approval was necessary for safety, or belonging, or simply being allowed to exist without friction. And you learned, through repetition and consequence, that your natural emotional register was inconvenient. You were too quiet when they wanted enthusiasm, too still when they wanted movement, too measured when the room was operating at a frequency you simply didn't share. And the feedback came, not always in words. Sometimes it came as a look, a withdrawal, a silence that taught you exactly what was expected. So you adapted. You got good at reading rooms. You developed a precise internal sensor that tells you, within moments of entering a social environment, what emotional performance is required, and you produce it, not because you are manipulative, but because you learned that not producing it had costs you weren't willing to pay anymore. The adaptation was intelligent. The adaptation was survival. It just also happened to be the beginning of a long separation between who you were presenting and who you actually were. And that separation has grown, quietly, for years. This followed you into classrooms where the louder students got called on and your quietness was mistaken for absence of thought. Into friendships where you kept pace with other people's emotional highs until the friendship ended and you realized you'd been performing rather than connecting. Into workplaces where the culture demanded visible enthusiasm for projects, for team meetings, for things that in no way warranted enthusiasm. And you gave it, because the alternative was being marked as someone who didn't care, didn't fit, didn't belong. And here is the interior monologue you run in those moments. The one nobody hears. They want me to be excited about this. I can tell they need me to match what they're feeling, or they'll think I'm not engaged. So I'll give them the nod, the lean in, the slight widening of the eyes. I'll find the one genuine thing I can offer, and I'll amplify it past its real size. I'll perform enough enthusiasm that the transaction completes, and then I'll find a reason to step away before I have to sustain it. You do this because it works. In the short term, it smooths everything over. The conversation continues. The person feels validated. The social contract is honored. Nobody walks away thinking you are rude, but you walk away knowing that you weren't actually there. That the version of you that showed up performed what was needed, and the real version, the one who processes things differently, who doesn't generate emotion on command, who can be fully present and fully quiet at the same time. That version waited outside the door. And when you try to stop performing, when you decide, just this once, to stay in your actual register instead of climbing to theirs, the consequence lands immediately. The shift in the room, the slight cool in their tone, the question, direct or indirect, of whether you're okay, whether something is wrong, whether you're upset with them. Because your authentic state, the one that doesn't spike and perform, reads as disapproval to people who have only ever understood engagement as emotional volume. So you go back to performing. Because the alternative is explaining yourself constantly to people who weren't asking a genuine question. They were applying social pressure in the shape of a question. The suppression isn't neutral. When you perform an emotional state for long enough, you start to lose the thread of what you actually feel. You'll be in the middle of a conversation, doing the matching, and you'll notice nothing. Not numbness exactly. Just a kind of internal static that comes from broadcasting on a frequency that isn't yours. And the question underneath all of this isn't whether you're normal. You already know you're not abnormal. The question is harder than that. It is this. If you stopped performing, if you held your actual register in every room without apology, would there be anyone left who could tolerate the real version of you? Or have you built every significant relationship on a version of yourself that only exists during the performance of use? That is the question, and it deserves an honest answer rather than a polite one. The word that has been applied to you, cold, distant, difficult, closed off, is not a description. It is a complaint dressed up as a diagnosis. Think about what it actually means for someone to call you cold. It means they projected an emotional temperature onto you, expected you to meet them there, and when you didn't, they named the gap as your failure. Not their projection's failure, yours. The assumption embedded in that complaint is that the other person's emotional state is the correct baseline, and your deviation from it is the problem. But there is something structurally dishonest about this accusation that is worth naming precisely. When someone calls you cold for not matching their energy, they are using a moral-sounding word. Cold implies indifference, cruelty, absence of care to describe something that is actually neutral, a different emotional register. Calling someone cold for not mirroring your enthusiasm is like calling someone deaf for not echoing your music. It is a category error. And it is an error that benefits the person making it, because it reframes their preference as your obligation. Consider what emotional matching actually requires, that you abandon your current internal state to perform someone else's, that you treat your genuine affect as less valid than their pre-aired affect, that you subordinate your inner life to the maintenance of their social comfort. This is not connection. This is compliance. And the two have been so thoroughly conflated in the social script, most of us were handed that people genuinely cannot tell the difference anymore. Cold is the wrong word. The right word is unborrowed. You don't borrow emotional states that don't belong to you. That is not coldness. That is self-possession. The capacity to remain in your own emotional register in high-pressure social environments is a function of interoceptive clarity. That is the ability to accurately sense your internal state and treat it as reliable information, rather than something to be overridden. People with high interoceptive clarity tend to not drift into emotional performances they don't actually feel, not because they lack empathy, but because their internal signal is strong enough that they notice immediately when they're deviating from it. The drift feels like something. It registers as dissonance. The people who find energy matching easy, who slip into whatever emotional register the room demands without friction, are not more socially skilled. They are often less internally connected. The performance costs them less because there is less genuine internal state competing with the role they're playing. That's not a virtue. It's a kind of psychological porousness that is only mistaken for sociability, because sociability has been narrowly defined as enthusiastic agreement with whatever is happening. Your reluctance to perform is not a deficit in social wiring. It is evidence of a strong, calibrated internal signal, one that knows the difference between authentic engagement and theatrical mimicry and refuses to confuse them. Pay attention to who gets most bothered when you don't match their energy. Not irritated, most bothered, persistently, insistently bothered. It is almost never people who are emotionally secure in themselves. People who are genuinely comfortable in their own internal state do not require your mirroring to feel validated. If you're calm when they're excited, they process it as a personality difference and move on. The interaction does not collapse. Their sense of self does not deflate. They don't need the room to confirm their emotional reality. The people who push back hardest when you hold your register are the ones who rely on reflection to feel real. They generate emotional energy and need it returned to them amplified. When it isn't, when you receive their energy calmly rather than amplifying it, they experience your calm as a verdict on their excess, as judgment, as rejection. The accusation of coldness is almost always a projection. They feel judged, so they judge. They feel unseen, so they name you the one who fails to see. You are not responsible for being someone else's mirror. A mirror does not have a self. You do. People who do not perform emotional states they don't have are, over time, extraordinarily trustworthy, not in the moral sense necessarily, though often that too, but in the calibration sense. When you express enthusiasm, it is real. When you express concern, it has genuine weight. When you say something is good, people can trust that you aren't just matching the room. Your baseline is not performance. So when you deviate from it, the deviation means something. Think about what this actually feels like from the outside. You have likely been in the presence of someone who validates everything, who calls every project brilliant, who responds to every piece of news with exactly calibrated enthusiasm, whose warmth is indistinguishable from a performance of warmth. And you may have noticed, over time, that you stopped bringing them the things that actually mattered to you, because their response told you nothing. It was not feedback, it was echo. And you cannot build anything real on an echo. Your calibrated engagement is the opposite of that. When you tell someone their work is good, they know you mean it, because they have watched you be genuinely uncertain about other things. When you show up for someone in a crisis, they know it is because you assessed the situation and chose to be there, not because showing up is your default performance. Your presence, precisely because it is not automatic, carries information. It means you actually decided. This is rare. In social environments saturated with performed positivity, reflexive enthusiasm, and mirrored responses, where everyone is telling everyone else that their ideas are brilliant and their mood is contagious, your authentic register stands out as signal, not noise. People who pay attention notice it. They come to you when they want a real response rather than a comfortable one. They trust what you say because they've learned that what you say costs you something, that you aren't just giving them back their own feelings at slightly higher volume. The advantage is not charm, it is credibility, and credibility outlasts every performance. This is the distinction that everything else depends on. When this trait is suppressed, when you force yourself to perform energy you don't have, to match a register that isn't yours, to smile and nod and spike and mirror on command, it turns against you. Not in a single catastrophic way, in a slow, grinding way that produces chronic depletion, a growing gap between your internal experience and your external behavior, and eventually a kind of alienation from your own reactions. You stop trusting what you feel because you've overridden it so many times. The suppression trains you to treat your own inner state as inconvenient, something to be managed rather than inhabited. When this trait is used, when you stop apologizing for your register and start operating from it, it functions as precision. You engage when genuine engagement exists. You offer warmth when you actually feel it. You maintain your stillness when that stillness is more honest than performance would be. You stop filling silence with manufactured affect and start trusting that silence, held without anxiety, communicates something real. The same trait that makes you exhausting to manage when it is suppressed makes you rare and reliable when it is owned. The difference is not the trait. The difference is whether you are fighting it or working with it. You're working with it. Politeness never required performance. It only ever required respect, and you can give that from exactly where you are. The first thing to change is the internal language, because language is not just description, it is the frame through which you understand what's happening inside you, and therefore what you do with it. Stop using the word cold when you think about yourself in these moments, not because it's unkind to yourself, though it is, but because it is inaccurate, and inaccurate self-language produces distorted decisions. When you call yourself cold for not mirroring someone's excitement, you are accepting their frame. You are treating their emotional expectations as the objective standard and measuring yourself against it. The frame is wrong before the measurement even begins. The replacement language is not worn as a correction to cold. That would just be flattery moving in the opposite direction. The accurate language is present on my own terms. When you don't match someone's energy, you are not absent. You are present in your actual register, with your actual internal state, operating from your actual experience of the moment. That is not a failure of presence. It is a different kind of presence, and a more honest one. When the familiar internal monologue begins, when you feel the pull to calculate the appropriate performance, the language to use is, I am already here. This is where I am. The calculation stops being about what to perform and becomes about what is actually true for you right now. That's the replacement, not affirmation, orientation. Not every environment suppresses this trait. Some environments allow it to function at full capacity. The work is to tell them apart clearly, not to assume that because some environments punish your register, all of them do. Environments that suppress this trait tend to share certain qualities. They reward visible enthusiasm over accurate assessment. They interpret emotional restraint as lack of investment. They conflate social performance with social value. These are often high-volume social environments. Certain workplaces, certain social circles, certain family dynamics, where emotional expressiveness is the currency, and where people who don't spend freely are assumed to be withholding. Environments where this trait functions well look different. They tend to value accuracy over performance. They interpret your stillness as attention rather than detachment. The people in them have enough internal stability that they don't require your mirroring to feel secure. These environments exist. They are not rare, but they often require you to stop auditing yourself so relentlessly that you never notice them. The practical move is not to eliminate the suppressing environments. Most of them cannot be eliminated, and some of them contain people you genuinely care about. The practical move is to stop expecting your trait to work in environments that are structurally opposed to it, and to stop treating your discomfort in those environments as evidence of your failure. Discomfort is evidence of a mismatch between your trait and the environment's demand. That is diagnostic information. It is not a verdict on your social worth, but know which rooms you're walking into. Adjust your expectations accordingly, and stop measuring your trait by how it performs in the rooms most designed to punish it. The next time someone names your authentic register as a problem, calls you cold, asks why you're being so serious, tells you you need to loosen up, implies that your calmness is actually disapproval in disguise, you need something to say to yourself before you respond to them. Not a line, not a comeback. 2 internal sentences that reset your orientation before you open your mouth. The first sentence is, "This is a comment about what they need from me, not what I am doing wrong." This is not a rationalization. It is an accurate description of what is happening. Their comment is a request for emotional service disguised as feedback. Receiving it as feedback produces apology and performance. Receiving it accurately produces clarity. The second sentence is, I can respond without becoming their reaction. This means you do not have to match their frustration or their disappointment or their social pressure. You can acknowledge it, you can address it if genuine relationship warrants that, and you can do it from your own register. Warmly, if warmth is real in the moment. Calmly, if calm is what you have. The response does not have to be a performance of the response they wanted. From that internal position, you can say almost anything, and it will carry weight. Because it's coming from somewhere real. This is not about pride. Pride is a performance in the other direction. It requires an audience. It needs to be seen. It is still calibrated against other people's opinion of you. Ownership is different. Ownership is what happens when you stop requiring external permission to exist as you actually are. The mental posture of someone who has stopped treating this trait as a liability looks like this. They walk into a high-energy room, and they do not immediately calculate the performance required. They are curious rather than strategic. They engage with what genuinely interests them. They offer their actual reactions without pre-editing them for palatability. And when someone pushes back against their register, when someone reads their calm as coldness, they don't collapse into apology. They don't inflate into defense. They hold their position in the way that a person holds their position when they know what they're standing on. The trait is not the problem it was presented to you as. It never was. And the version of you that walks through rooms without performing is not a rougher, less likable version. It is a more coherent one, a version with edges that correspond to something real rather than a surface that has been sanded smooth to avoid friction. Stop treating your internal state as something to manage before it reaches other people. Start treating it as something to communicate when the communication is real and to hold quietly when it isn't. Both of those are legitimate. Neither of them requires a performance. There is a larger pattern here, wider than energy matching, wider than social performance and its costs. You have been measuring yourself against a standard that was built by and for people who process social reality differently than you do. A standard that assumes emotional visibility is equivalent to emotional depth, that enthusiasm is evidence of engagement, that a person who performs less is present less. This standard was not designed with you in mind. It was not designed against you either. It was designed unconsciously by the majority to describe the majority. And when you don't fit I, tie, or T, the instinct is to treat the standard as correct and yourself as deficient. But a ruler designed for one thing does not become accurate by being applied to something else. The measurement is only meaningful if the instrument matches the thing being measured. You have been handed the wrong instrument for your entire life, and you have been using it to take your own measure, and the readings have been wrong. Here is what is actually true about you right now, stated without softening. You are not someone who struggles to connect. You are someone who connects differently, with less noise, with more precision, with a lower tolerance for performance, on both sides of the conversation. The people who have experienced you at full capacity, in environments that suited your register, know something that the louder rooms never saw, that your engagement, when it is genuine, is total. That when you are actually interested, you are more present than the people who are always performing presence, that your stillness is not vacancy. It is where you actually live. The cost of what you've been doing, the energy matching, the performing, the running of the calculation, is not just exhaustion. The real cost is the years spent believing that your natural way of being in the world was a liability rather than a specific, functional, honest way of operating. The time spent in relationships built on your performance of yourself rather than your actual self. The rooms you walked through without leaving any real trace of you behind, because you traded yourself for social smoothness at the door. You don't owe anyone a performance of your internal state. You never did. Politeness is respect maintained. It is attention given. It is the honest acknowledgement of another person's presence. None of those things require you to feel what they feel. perform what they perform, or spike and mirror, and match on command. The connection you've been told requires performance, requires enthusiasm, requires visible warmth, requires your emotional register to bend to theirs. That connection isn't connection. It is management. And you have managed people's comfort at the cost of your own coherence for long enough. The standard was wrong. The ruler was wrong. And you have been accurate this entire time. You were never cold. You were just the only one in the room telling the truth.